Hello again, real estate knowledge addicts. We are back, episode 2 in our segment number 7 regarding calculating timelines. And today we are going over the closing timeline. We went over the mountain of nuance involved with contingencies and their timelines in the last video. Now we're going to go over a bit of the bird's eye view of the actual closing and how long it takes to get from point A, the accepted offer, to point B, the final table. So your average lifespan of a real estate transaction from accepted offer, contract signing to closing is somewhere between 30 to 60 days, depending on a mountain of different factors as we've described in previous videos. Those are including inspections, appraisals, what type of lending we're talking about, what type of home, what type of buyer, et cetera, et cetera. There are many, many different factors. But generally speaking, all of them should fit into 30 to 60 days, and it is on you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that don't need no stinking realtor, to make sure it happens in as swift a period of time as possible. So let's unpack a little bit. First is the accepted offer. You've negotiated each term individually with all the buyers. You've chosen the best buyer. You've accepted an offer, and now it's time to sign contract. The contract is created typically by you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, your realtor, but you haven't got one, or your attorney. So if you've got access to standard forms with fillable fields, you can do it yourself, create a purchase and sales agreement that is going to be generally acceptable to most buyers and their agents and attorneys because you've gotten those from a reputable source. If you don't have access to those documents, you're going to go to your attorney. Attorneys are busy people. You're going to need to crack that whip, as we keep saying, to make sure they're doing their job very quickly, because again, we have that buyer on the hook and we don't want them to wriggle away from us just because the attorney took a week and a half to create the initial draft of purchase and sales. Regardless, whether it's a standard fillable form or one created by you or your attorney, the buyer and the buyer's attorney are going to want to review that form. They may have proposed edits, they may have pieces of that contract that they don't like at all, that they want to remove, et cetera, and that takes time. So crucially important that you get the first draft of the purchase and sales agreement out to the other side as swiftly as possible to allow them time to review. All that said, really, generally, it's 48 hours, 72 hours that you want your purchase and sales contract to be signed from the time that you actually accept the offer. Now remember, we described in the last video, on that phone call where you say, hey, we're accepting your offer, you want them to begin scheduling their inspections and their appraisal. Remember that, crucially important, especially if it takes your attorney too damn long to create the purchase and sales agreement. Moving on to the escrow period. Now, if you are unaware, contracts are not, generally speaking, valid in most places without consideration being paid from one side to the other. There's got to be skin in the game, we keep calling it. In this case, it's referred to as the earnest money deposit. Now, it's also up to you to structure the language in your purchase and sales agreement to your own benefit and make sure that delivery of the earnest money deposit by the buyer or its agents time is of the essence surrounding their delivery of that deposit. They don't have an unlimited amount of time to get that deposit to you. It is associated with the terms and covenants of that contract, and it needs to be delivered within a reasonable amount of time. Typically speaking, that is 48 to 72 hours. If you fail to create the language in the purchase and sales contract that says time is of the essence, all you've said is, hey, I'd kind of like that deposit within 48 to 72 hours, but if you don't get it to me on time, that's okay. Time is of the essence forces that buyer to deliver that earnest money deposit in the allotted amount of time, or they are considered to be in breach of contract, which could lend a favorable upper hand, legally speaking, to you down the road. Moving on, your buyer hopefully has diligently provided their earnest money deposit in the allowed time. Now we move on to the title search. So the buyer's attorney, not yours, the buyer's attorney is going to perform search on your deed, your title, your supposed ownership of that property, and the ownership claim of previous owners that transferred ownership to you, and on down the line. Diligent attorneys will probably look back 100 years if your house is that old, your property is that old, checking each time the deed and title changed hands and making sure there are no defects in title, no blemishes, no transcription errors. Each deed subsequent reads, much like the one before, involves the same property description, et cetera, et cetera. Now again, attorneys are busy people, and this one isn't yours. It's the buyer's attorney that is doing this. But again, this needs to happen in as swift a period of time as possible. And you, Mr. and Mrs. Diligent Home Seller, need to make sure that you get confirmation that the title search is A, being conducted, and B, at some point completed without issue. If there are any title defects, it can take months for them to be cured, and you'd rather know now than weeks and weeks from today, because frankly, the buyer has no vested interest in letting you know that the title search has been performed. Obviously, your attorney hopefully is diligent as you are, and is going to be checking in with the other side to make sure that they get the information, but we can't leave it up to chance. And the whip typically comes from your real estate professionals and their team, a transaction coordinator if you've got one, but you don't have one because you don't need no stinker realtor, so it's on you. Make sure you crap the whip. Moving on, hopefully there were no title issues found, and we are approaching the final walkthrough. This is the last time that the buyer gets to visit the residence or property, whatever it is, to make sure that it is at least in the condition that they saw it in. There are no new defects, no new circumstances that have arisen that weren't disclosed to them previously when they saw the home. And to make sure that you or your property or your tenant's property or whatever has been removed from the property prior to the closing as described in the purchase and sales agreement. There can be many different circumstances that were written into that contract to allow for some of your personal belongings or a tenant's belongings to have remained if it's been previously negotiated, but that needs to be taken care of at the time of offer negotiation or sometime during the escrow period to make sure that you are leaving the property in the proper condition. Broom swept, generally speaking. Now, that is going to happen very close, generally speaking, as possible to the closing. Typically the day before, but also very typically the morning of the closing, and the closing is going to happen maybe an hour or 2 hours immediately after. The point is the buyer typically doesn't want really any time to be able to elapse between the point where they've laid eyes on the property the last time and walk to the closing table, purely to make sure that there's no time for anything to go wrong, more or less. Now, you've got the general overview, the 30,000-foot view of the closing timeline, and I've stressed I don't know how many times that it is up to you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, to crack the whip on all of the service professionals on the periphery of the real estate transaction, on the sidelines. Everybody that's got their hands in this thing. The loan officer, the bank, the bank's attorney, your attorney, the buyer, the buyer's attorney, the buyer's agent, whom else? The appraiser, the inspectors, could be many. You are going to be fielding calls from all these people. They're going to be emailing you with reply all emails with everybody copied. I need this document. I need that document. Please supply me with this or that. And it's up to you to manage this whole process. And if you're not being detailed with your information, if you're not being available and responsive in a very short period of time, it's just going to delay your closing, and that is going to cost you money. So you got it. You got all the information you need. Next, we're going to go into financing timelines and how they differ, which financing products are going to make your transaction longer versus shorter, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see you on that one. Make sure your pencils are sharp and your notebooks clean.